right. Whenever you're ready, I'm ready.
All right, we are live and rolling. Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is the City of Morro Bay City Council. This is a special meeting. It is Tuesday, May 24th, 2022, 3:30 p.m. Pursuant to Assembly Bill 361 and Government Code Section 54953, this meeting will be conducted telephonically through Zoom. Ways to participate, watch, and submit public comment for the meeting will be provided by the clerk when we do have public comment time. You can do that through your phone using the raise hand feature, or you can join the webinar directly as noted on the agenda itself. There's a link there that you can click on if you'd like to join via that route or through the city website as well. So welcome, and if we could have a roll call to see if we have a quorum, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Addis.
Here.
Councilmember Ford.
Here.
Councilmember Heller.
Here.
Councilmember Barton.
Here.
And Mayor Heading.
Present. We do have a quorum. Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Again, ladies and gentlemen, today is a special meeting for the first phase review of the City of Morro Bay budget. This will be divided into two different meetings. We'll go from 3:30 to 5 p.m. today and then resume tomorrow, Wednesday, May 25th, to look at items number 2 and 3 on the agenda. Today, we'll be looking at agenda item number 1. I want to just up front thank our great staff for providing a significant amount of information, not only to the council, with a great amount of background information, but for an excellent staff report as usual, and a well-informed, well-devised budget that has been presented in a very, I think, easy to read manner. Also want to recognize the links that we now have to our new system, and I know Sarah will talk about that, that's online, that gives the community access to the detail in a very easy, readable format. So with that introduction, I'm grateful for our city manager and our assistant city manager, and I will turn it over to Mr. Collins, our city manager, and Ms. Johnson Rios, our assistant city manager.
Thank you, Mayor, council members, community members, staff, for tuning in to this very important conversation. We're going to have about a 40-minute presentation. There's a lot to throw at you this evening. I believe Sarah Johnson Rios, our Assistant CM and Administrative Services Director, will be sharing her screen for the presentation, but I'll go ahead and jump in now. So there will be a couple evenings, or I guess this afternoon and evening tomorrow's discussion about our budget. Today we'll focus on the operations budget for the city, and then we'll give a very brief overview of the capital improvement budget. And then tomorrow evening, 5:30, we'll discuss the capital improvement budget, wharf project, water projects, as well as an overview of the harbor department in depth, again, tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. So with that, we'll provide context of the overall budget. Sarah will present the citywide budget overview and getting into operating budgets, both departmental and then major fund reviews. And then again, tomorrow we'll focus on CIPs in the harbor. So with that, next slide, please. So this evening, we would be looking for any kind of direction via motion regarding the operations budget, and tomorrow the capital budget. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just some high-level themes that are outlined in the budget that's available online. We're continuing to observe recovery from COVID-19, which hit us in earnest in March of 2020, and really took a big swath out of our revenues for several months, which greatly impacted our ability to staff and operate our services for our community. We also had to pivot to focus on the public health emergency. Since that time, we have experienced recovery. That's been aided greatly by the passage of Measure E by our community members in November of 2020, which is generating another $2.5 million for public safety, cleanliness, and infrastructure. We've also been aided by the American Rescue Plan Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by the President in 2021, which provides federal assistance to cities as well as a bunch of other sectors of our community. We are able to fund our personnel in a number of ways, both in increasing our staffing back to COVID levels, but also including in our budget funds to help improve compensation for our employees, as well as training and team building opportunities. This budget invests $18.7 million into our built environment, which is the capital projects in which our community relies upon. It's streets, water, sewer, stormwater, providing better access to those with disabilities, improving our parks and things like that. We're also continuing construction on our water reclamation facility with the plans to complete construction of the first two elements of the wharf facility, the advanced treatment facility that is, and the conveyance that brings all the sewer to the plant and returns the clean water to the ocean. Those will be completed in time to meet our time schedule order by the state. This budget also strengthens our reserve funds to prepare for the unexpected. I know there's a lot of talk out in the world about impending recession or slowdown in the economy just because of inflation and other pressures at the macro level that may impact our ability to fund things. This budget also invests over $1 million in our pension trust to lower our overall pension liability. And as the mayor mentioned, we do have a new budget platform that we believe increases transparency and clearer communication of City Council's budget priorities. Next slide, please. So again, on the short-term factors, we are again experiencing recovery from the financial impacts of COVID-19. We're extremely grateful to our community again for passage of Measure E that's aiding in that process. Something that we're watching closely is inflation, which is reached levels not seen in 40 years. It's topped 8% over last year, and the California Construction Cost Index was 24.5% this April over the previous April, which is just incredible increase in costs which is having an impact on our capital projects. The world is experiencing a staffing shortage, and state and local governments are not exempt. In fact, we probably face that pressure even more so than other sectors because the business community is able to respond quicker with increases in compensation. But this budget does try to invest and counter that, what's going on in the greater community regarding labor shortages. Infrastructure needs are immense. We do have plans in place for some of our capital needs, and others we don't. So we need to focus on that to make sure we're prioritizing those needs appropriately. Our pension liability, again, is still significantly underfunded, much like every other city in our state, and we need to continue to make investments there. While we do have some headwinds, we also have some things aiding us in continuing to see that improvement from COVID-19. So we are hopeful, but we need to be mindful of these challenges I just mentioned, and be steadfast in ensuring that we have sufficient reserves to weather the next emergency or economic slowdown. Next slide. So under the budget, we are focusing on the big three. Obviously, our operations are the services our community depends upon, and in order to deliver those services, we must retain and attract talented staff to carry out those services and oversee and manage those services. So we invest heavily there. We are increasing our capital investment in other areas that we haven't seen in a while, such as paving, and we need to continue to do that. And we're very thankful again with the passage of Measure E, as well as our community's continued support of water and sewer rates and other fees that allow us to make improvements to our built environment. And then we're investing in reducing our long-term pension liabilities through $1 million investment in a pension trust fund, so that those funds can only be used to help reduce our pension liabilities moving forward, and also seeking other opportunities, including cost sharing with our employees for that. Next slide. And as always, we're focused on the City Council goals of public infrastructure, fiscal sustainability, and economic vitality, housing, climate action, and community health. We focus on the services that we deliver, the infrastructure, but these overarching goals are kind of our looking forward and addressing those pressing needs beyond the services we provide, and collaborating both internally within the county with our state and federal partners to help address these bigger issues. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to Sarah, I did want to say a word of thanks to her and the administrative services team. Have done an exceptional job leading this budget process with 100% turnover in their staff. So it's an entire new admin services team, but have been guided well by Sarah's leadership. Kelly Matos is an analyst in the administrative services department, took on the challenge of this new budget tool and did a great job of coordinating. And Emily Conrad, our finance manager, has done a great job of assisting that while also taking care of the accounting side of the house and doing a great job there with new staff. And last, again, I want to thank our community members for their support of Measure E that makes our recovery possible, and their continued support of our capital projects through water and sewer rates and other mechanisms. So with that, I'd love to turn over to our Assistant City Manager, Sarah Johnson-Rios. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Collins, and good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I was also going to thank staff, and so I thank Scott for doing that. I want to reiterate my thanks to Kelly Mattis and Emily Conrad on the finance team, and also mention thanks to the department head team for their contributions to this budget and all of the services that they provide that are outlined within the budget, and to Mr. Collins for his leadership through this process. So many thanks. And a note about the presentation. I have a lot of slides here. I'm not going to go into great depth about all of them because I want to make sure you have enough time to discuss. So if we have questions, we can come back to them as you would like going forward. And I'll pause at the end of each section to see, Mr. Mayor, if you'd like to take questions or if you would like me to keep going. Okay, so jumping in to the citywide budget overview. I just wanted to remind council and the community about the budget timeline. As Mr. Collins described, the first input into this process was the city council goal setting process that took place last November. And since then, there have been and will be about 10 other public meetings where the budget or key budget inputs will be discussed. This will culminate with budget adoption, which will likely take place on June 28th this year. And these budget study sessions today and tomorrow are really critical inputs for us. So we thank council and public for their input. Here's a quick screenshot of the new digital budget book format, and this is online. There's a link directly from the city's homepage to the proposed budget. It includes a lot of increased visual charts and graphs this year that allow the reader to view information in various formats, more visual formats. And also this allows the reader to navigate to specific sections of the budget without having to print or view along a PDF document. However, people can still download and print a PDF document and have a paper copy if they prefer. The digital format is consistent with council's climate change goal and our efforts to reduce paper use. And one last note, I just wanted to mention that the department specific information is all available online as part of the budget book. Today's presentation is really going to focus primarily on major funds, but I want to ensure everyone that all of the department specific operational detail is available online. And consistent with the Government Finance Officers Association best practices, it is important for us to present information both by fund and by department, and also by department by fund. So, and for anyone who's interested in looking at, for example, what portion of the police department is funded by the general fund and what portion is funded by Measure Q and E fund, for example, that's all available in the departmental section of the budget. And I did just want to note that to the end of increasing transparency and clear communications, This new portal does come with an optional transparency module that staff will be evaluating after budget adoption as staff capacity permits. We're evaluating this as a potential kind of budget and brief tool, or at least one tool that pairs demographic information with financial data to provide more context to the city's revenues and expenditures. And now I will jump into the numbers. A quick note, we're presenting a lot of this information focused on numbers net of transfers. And what that means is transfers in the budget represent when the city moves money from one fund to another fund, as required in some cases by governmental accounting standards. We're actually making efforts to reduce and minimize the magnitude of these transfer budgets as we're beginning to consolidate funds where there's no legal requirement for funds to be separate. But right now, presenting the budget net of transfers is a more accurate depiction of the level of actual revenues and expenditures. So this year, for fiscal year 22-23, the city's total expenditure budget and the proposed budget net of transfers is 53.8 million. Including transfers, that works out to 76.5 million. And citywide expenditure budget is broken down into the operating budget, which is 35.1 million, and the capital budget, which is 18.7 million. This is an increase of only 0.5% from the prior year amended budget. And that's in part because, as you recall, we made significant mid-year budget adjustments in fiscal year 21-22. Otherwise, that would have been, a larger increase from the adopted budget in the prior year. And on the revenue side, the citywide revenue budget is 46.4 million net of transfers. If you include the transfers, it's 69.3 million. There's actually a very small net reduction citywide in revenues from the amended budget. That's just due to some anomalous factors, one of which is no longer recording T-bid revenues as coming in directly to the city, because those are now passed directly to Visit Morro Bay. That's the local assessment share of transient or of hotel taxes. And then this year's budget represents a reduction in direct CIP revenues. So overall operating revenues are increasing, which we'll see in a moment. And then this just shows citywide revenues by fund. So you can see that the largest revenue generating fund for the city is the general fund, followed by the utilities funds, and then the Measure Q&E fund represents a growing proportion of citywide revenue, which this chart demonstrates more clearly the increase in local sales tax revenue since the passage of Measure E in 2020. So this is an increasingly important component of the city's revenues, and it allows the city to address critical public safety and infrastructure needs for the community. And then on the expenditure side, again, this is citywide. Oh, I'm sorry, one more revenue slide. This just shows revenues by source. So we'll get into some of the types of revenues in more detail when we look at the funds. But overall, outside of interfund transfers, revenues from current services are the largest source of revenue for the city. Those are services that individuals pay for, such as water and sewer rates, harbor leases, recreation classes, et cetera. And then the next largest category of revenues citywide is taxes. And I'll go into those in more detail with the general fund discussion. So now for expenditures, this is just showing expenditures by fund, shows a very similar picture to the revenue chart, showing that the general fund is the largest share of the expenditure budget, followed by the utilities funds, and then Measure Q&E. By expense type, we can see, historically, we see spikes in 2021 and 21-22 for the water reclamation facilities, actuals, and budget. And in fiscal year 22-23, the budget represents new budget appropriations, not carry forward budget. So it's showing basically a lower budget, given that the water reclamation facility will be in the latter stages of construction.
Sarah, do you have the ability to point?
I'm
just
not
thinking of our
sure
viewers.
if you can.
If not,
that's
that's okay.
Can you see my mouse? No, you can't.
No.
Let's see.
That's okay. I was just thinking of our viewers, wondering.
It's not. I have a tool. Here we go. Yes.
There you go. There
I
you
do.
go. Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
I will
you.
use that. Okay, and so here we see, just for the proposed budget year, the breakdown of how the city spends its money. What do we spend our money on citywide? And you can see in the green piece of the pie chart here that personnel services represents the largest share of citywide expenditures. That's true when you look at the citywide budget overall, and also when you look at just the operating budget. And this is because we provide city services using people. And so on a citywide basis, it represents just over 1/3 of the city's expenditures, and on an operating basis, just over 1/2. That's followed by services, which represent the next largest share of citywide expenditures. And that includes things like legal services, consultant services, software services, other services that are required to deliver service to the community. And then capital outlay in this year's proposed budget represents roughly 1/4 of the overall proposed expenditure budget. This is another way to slice and dice the expenditures, showing the citywide budget by department. And what I would point out here is that you can see that the blue, which is capital projects, and the green, which are interfund transfers, fluctuate pretty significantly based on, in this case, in recent history, the water reclamation facility or other capital expenditures. But the operating by department fluctuates much less over time. And then I'll move into personnel. We do want to spend a few minutes talking about personnel changes and personnel trends citywide. So in terms of changes to full-time positions proposed for fiscal year 22-23, the budget proposes adding 2.1 net new full-time positions. This is on the heels of adding a few additional positions in mid-year 21-22. And so this represents what the city manager was describing as the restoration of pre-pandemic levels of services and recovery, and in some cases, additional services. So for this year, it represents the addition of a community services officer, which would be a non-sworn position in the police department to assist the department with significant workload challenges. This would help the officers respond to non-emergency issues. And then in the community development department, there's the addition of a building inspector, code enforcement officer to support the short-term rental ordinance implementation and to address increased needs for building inspections and plan checks. And then in the public works department, there's no net change, but we're proposing adding an administrative technician position and eliminating the environmental programs manager position. Some of the duties from that position can be covered by other positions. And then we've also included this year a part-time chart citywide. This represents the number of full-time equivalent positions based on the number of part-time staffing hours budgeted in each department. And so this year's proposed budget proposes adding the equivalent of 7 full-time positions in the form of part-time hours. That's broken down into adding the equivalent of 4.6 additional positions to the Recreation Services Division. And that's a number of actually part-time positions that are required to continue to restore service levels to pre-COVID levels. And then in the fire department, adding additional part-time staffing in the reserves program to ensure that we have sufficient reserves, particularly during what's anticipated to be a challenging wildfire season. And then the remainder is various small changes that equate to less than 1 FTE citywide. In addition to the position changes, there are a few ongoing factors, personnel factors that we wanted to highlight. There are some areas where staffing deficiencies remain, or where we know that workload levels are very high and perhaps hard to sustain. This is kind of linked to the Great Resignation conversation in Mr. Collins's slides. And so we want to ensure that we are proactively doing what we can in terms of an organizational assessment, and then in the next bullet, a classification and compensation study to ensure that we're adequately resourcing the city to deliver the services that are needed, and also to ensure that our compensation remains competitive and that we're able to continue to recruit and retain a talented workforce. And as you may have read just in the headlines, wages are increasing locally and nationally, in large part due to the inflation, record-setting inflation that we're seeing. And so this proposed budget does include placeholders for compensation increases for staff pending the final outcome of labor negotiations, which are ongoing currently with the city's 3 bargaining groups. We also have the ever-increasing Calpers costs. This isn't dramatically impacting the current proposed year budget, but we know that our normal Calpers contribution rates for our annual payments for retirement will increase in 23-24 because of a recent decision by Calpers to lower their projected rate of return. We could see additional decisions along those lines if Calpers continues to receive lower rates of return. And that's in addition to the large unfunded accrued liability. Mr. Collins already mentioned we will be contributing, pending the adoption of the proposed budget, just over $1 million citywide into a new pension trust that will be created in 22-23, consistent with council's new pension reserve policy. And then there is some good news finally. The city's other post-employment benefits liability, which represents the cost of future contributions to retiree healthcare, that is largely funded. So we have a trust fund established for that. It's largely fully funded. So the proposed budget does not include any additional contributions to that trust fund. And instead, we need to direct our attention to addressing the larger Calpers liability. The final slide here on citywide budget section is to note the increasing reserve levels that are projected. So this chart is a lot of data, but overall, the takeaways are that we are meeting our reserve policies for all funds. And that results in a projected reserve balance of 13.5 million at the end of 22-23 citywide, which equates to roughly 38% of the citywide operating budget in 22-23. So each fund has its own reserve policy, and that's based on operating budget in that fund, and all those details are in the budget document for each fund. But citywide, this is really an improved position for the city. And then looking at the general fund and all of the funds that are reported with the general fund in the annual comprehensive financial report, that projected reserve balance is about 8.6 million. So that includes our general fund emergency reserve balance, our unassigned general fund balance, and then those 4 other smaller general fund reserves. Those are all up to council's discretion, and they've been set aside for specific purposes according to the reserve policy. In total, that 8.6 million represents over 50% of the general fund operating budget. And I will pause there, Mayor, and see if you would like to take any questions or like me to keep going.
So I'd be okay unless, are there any council members that want to stop at each section with you going through the full presentation and taking questions? I'm just looking for head nods. Would that be okay, council? Fingers? Yes. So look, okay, yes. Sarah, go ahead, please.
Okay, great. So just a few slides to distinguish the operating budget from the citywide budget really quickly. The operating revenues are largely the same as the citywide revenues. This year, there are just a few $100,000 in direct CIP revenues, and those come from a portion of the state gas tax. But when we just look at operating revenues, we see that they're actually increasing by 2% citywide over last year's amended budget, which we had already increased the revenue budget at mid-year last year from the prior year adopted budget. So continuing to increase gradually. And let's see, I'll keep going unless come back if there's questions. So on operating expenditures, net of transfers, those are going to be 35.1 million in the proposed budget. And as I mentioned, those are only up 0.5% from last year's amended budget. And so that represents really kind of stable, both revenue and operating revenues and operating expenditures citywide. So this is a similar chart to what you looked at citywide, but this is just looking at operating expenditures by department, and we've taken out transfers. So you can see here, Public Works in blue is the largest share of citywide operating expenditures. That's because that includes all of the water and sewer utilities, operating costs, as well as all of the maintenance costs and Public Works administration and engineering. And then we have the police department as the next largest citywide operating expenditure budget, followed by the fire department, which is similar in size to the police department, and then a number of smaller operating departments, which all represent smaller shares of the budget. The smallest shares is the city council budget, followed by the city attorney budget. And then I'll go into major operating funds. I think this is the clearest way to kind of dig a layer deeper into the citywide budget. We have 49 active funds in the city currently. That's quite a few. And only 5 of those represent about 90% of financial activity for the city in terms of 90% of our revenues and expenditures. So I'll focus on these 5 funds. This is just looking at the relative scale of the 5 funds. Again, the general fund is the largest source of revenue and expenditures, followed by the utilities funds, followed by Measure Q&E, and finally Harbor. So we'll look at the general fund first, and we'll start with revenues. The general fund revenues are budgeted to increase by 9% from the prior year. You can see a pattern of steady actual and projected growth. So actuals, we're looking at actuals for fiscal years 2018-19 through fiscal year 2021. And we're looking at amended budget for fiscal year 21-22, proposed budget for fiscal year 22-23. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about the 4 largest sources of revenue for the general fund. The largest source of revenue for the general fund is property tax revenue. We're projecting that those will increase by 1% from the prior year budget, and those are based on the county assessor's office estimates. So I think last year's budget may have been a bit high, so we're returning these numbers to the county assessor's office projections this year. And the out years are projected to grow by about 3 to 4% per year. Transient occupancy taxes are the next largest source of revenue. Those are projected to increase by 2% for fiscal year 22-23, based on input from Visit Morro Bay, and they're looking at detailed average daily room rates and occupancy rates, et cetera. This reflects a relatively conservative projection that does allow for a potential slowdown in tourism in the latter part of the fiscal year. And I did want to note that in the review of the general fund budget, some CFAC members found this projection to be conservative. So staff has evaluated that. We do recommend a conservative approach to this particular revenue source because it is a more volatile revenue source. And we do have a history of budgeting that relatively conservatively and then reevaluating that at mid-year as we did last year. So we've left that where it's at least for the proposed budget. The sales taxes are projected to increase from 9% over last year's budget. And I want to note, thanks also in part to CFAC's input, this actually represents an increase of 2.2 to 3% from HDL's most recently updated 21-22 projection. So they give us updated projections every quarter, and we make periodic changes to the budget at mid-year when large changes are projected. So this is consistent with a gradual level of growth that HDL is projecting of about 2 to 3% from fiscal year 21-22 into 22-23, and actually also into the out years. And then you've got, moving on to revenues from current services. Those are projected to increase by 6%, which is consistent with the master fee schedule increases that council recently approved. I just wanted to note there's also a one-time revenue proposed from the American Rescue Plan Act fund of $740,000 to support the cost of providing government services, which is an eligible use under the Treasury's final rule, which just came out early in 2022. And then in the out years, you'll see in the forecast, we're projecting slower growth in the out years for general fund revenues. On the expenditure side, if you just look at this chart, it looks like expenditures are increasing very significantly this year. They are not, in fact, on an ongoing basis. This is largely due to one-time expenditures in 22-23, and in fact, a lot of those are actually interfund transfers. So I'll detail those in a second. But I wanted to point out that when you net those one-time factors out, the general fund is looking at an increase of about 5.8%, or just under $1 million from the prior year's amended budget. So looking at one-time expenditures this year, there are a number of expenditures, about 3.5 million, that are really aimed at improving the city's long-term fiscal sustainability. So what you're looking at with these first three bullets here is actually just interfund transfers to other general fund related reserves. And again, if those weren't all separate funds, this wouldn't necessarily appear as an expenditure, but they are budgeted as transfers since these are all separate funds. And then but the city will be retaining that cash in those other funds. And then also with the aim of improving fiscal sustainability, the general fund will be contributing 0.8 million in the proposed budget of the $1 million contributed to the pension trust. And then consistent with 2016 council direction, the proposed budget includes a loan payoff of the USDA loan for the fire station building. This would be done using one-time property sale proceeds and the Measure Q&E contribution, and it would result in a savings of about $500,000 in interest over the life of the loan. So switching back to kind of the ongoing operating expenditures in the general fund, this is just looking at the departmental share of the general fund. It's pretty similar to the citywide, although you can see that in the general fund only, the police department becomes the largest, followed by public works and fire, and sort of tied thereafter. And I'm going to skip this personnel slide, but we can come back to it if you have questions. We've already covered a lot of the citywide personnel trends, and this just details what's in the general fund. And then finally, this is going to be hard to read here, this 5-year general fund forecast. So I'll just verbally give you the highlights. And of course, this is in the staff report as well. So we've updated the 5-year forecast, which you last saw in February. And it demonstrates that the fund will have a positive ending fund balance for the forecast period. And it will meet the general fund emergency reserve policy through fiscal year 23-24, though it might not meet that reserve policy thereafter. That'll depend on what happens with obviously with revenues and expenditures. So this is a conservative forecast. We're using assumptions that expenditures will increase by roughly 5% per year, and revenues will increase by roughly 2 to 4% per year. So that gap is what's driving the gradual erosion of the fund balance in this forecast. But it's possible that revenue growth could outpace those projections, and or that expenditure growth could slow at the end of the forecast period, which would result in a more favorable picture. And we are in a strong position in terms of our reserve balances, which helps the city weather a potential recession or unanticipated financial impacts. And I will keep going to the Measure Q&E fund. We're looking at the same revenue projections for sales tax that we saw in the general fund. So we're using the same assumptions, the same HDL estimates, which results in $4.3 million of projected revenue in fiscal year 22-23. And on the expenditure side, Measure Q&E will expend the majority of its fund balance that was accumulated in prior years on capital costs, on one-time costs, and I'll go over those in a second. The ongoing costs remain relatively stable. I'll highlight some changes in a second. I did want to mention that CFAC reviewed these expenditures in detail at their April meeting. The individual comments are outlined in your staff report, but as a committee, they did not recommend any changes from the proposed Measure Q&E fund budget. So this just graphically depicts the breakdown of Measure Q&E funds expenditures. And a portion of this non-departmental, it's largely CIPs, but a portion is a $240,000 contribution to that loan payoff of the fire station loan. And it's actually the Measure Q&E fund that will realize the interest savings, since the Measure Q&E fund was paying those debt service payments. So it will be a good return on investment for the Q&E fund to contribute to that payoff now and save the interest costs from the debt service in the out years. And on the operating side, police and fire continue to make up the largest share of the Q&E fund's operating expenditures. This budget includes that community services officer that I mentioned in the police department, and some additional funding that I mentioned for the reserves program in the fire department. No major changes in public works. That is continuing the positions that were approved at mid-year 21-22. And then in the harbor fund, we're maintaining the lifeguard program here and also adding the part-time harbor reserves program in Measure Q&E to allow the harbor department to continue to maintain their current service levels. And that large $2.5 million capital contribution, which I think is the largest in the city's history, is based on, in part, spending prior year's fund balance and in part spending projected revenues for 22-23 on a number of different capital projects, primarily roadway improvements. And this pavement management project is in addition to a 21-22 pavement management project, which is staff is working on now. So this will be, you'll see in the CIP budget, this will be a total of a $1.7 million project for 22-23 on top of $1.1 million that's already budgeted. So that's a really significant investment that we're glad that the community has helped the city be able to make in capital work. CFAC also requested a 5-year forecast for the Measure Q&E fund, so we are happy to be able to provide that. Now, this uses the same assumptions as the general fund forecast, and it conservatively projects that sales taxes will increase by 3% in 23-24 and 2% in the out years. And then again, the same assumptions on the expenditure side, 5% annual increase. These result in Measure Q&E fund's ability to continue to contribute between 1.85 million and 2 million a year to capital projects. And I just want to note that it's, since this is just sales tax revenue, which can be somewhat volatile, we think it's important to maintain a balance of ongoing and one-time expenditures in this fund. And a final note, this fund does not have its own reserve policy because it's incorporated in the general fund emergency reserve policy, so that's why you're not seeing that there. Moving on to the water fund. Revenues are projected to be quite stable since rates are not projected to increase in 22-23. Expenditures are projected to increase, and this is in part because of one-time transfers out to the capital fund. These are detailed here for the ongoing transfers out for cost allocation and internal services, and then the one-time transfers out for the water reclamation facility project and all other water CIPs. We'll talk about the WRF project a lot more tomorrow, but this is assuming that the water fund is contributing still in that a 30% range. Its share of the WRF project's currently cash funded budget for 22-23. So that's where that number was derived. And so we also put together a 5-year forecast based on that assumption for the water fund and also based on the ongoing capital needs. These tie to the multi-year CIP plan that you see in the budget. And they're really what's driving this eroding fund balance over time. So based on current projected capital needs, which may continue to increase in cost based on the really high construction cost index increases that the city manager mentioned, the water fund currently is not projected to be able to maintain a positive fund balance or meet the reserve policy in the 4th and 5th years of the forecast. With the current rate structure, this is a baseline forecast that does not assume any rate increases. So this is something that staff is continuing to evaluate in light of the capital needs for the fund. The sewer fund, we're also projecting relatively stable revenue, no rate increases projected for 22-23. And on the expenditure side, a very similar story. There's a large operating surplus, of course, because of the fund's need to support its capital expenditures. And so you see here the transfers out to the sewer CIP fund to fund about $7.4 million of water reclamation facility project in 22-23. As we'll discuss more tomorrow, we're still evaluating other options for funding that project and still looking for grant funding and financing. But this budget assumes the most conservative option, that portion would be cash funded. And then there are a number of other One Water sewer CIP projects that are also budgeted. And so the 5-year sewer fund forecast, very similar methodology to the water fund. We are having a baseline forecast here and not projecting rate increases. And then we're looking at capital contributions that are tied to the multi-year capital plan in the proposed budget. And that actually results still in a positive ending fund balance for the sewer fund, and the sewer fund's ability to continue to meet its reserve policy. And as you recall, the sewer fund started the wharf project with a larger reserve, and that's what you're seeing here working through this 5-year forecast period. The harbor fund, I'll just touch on briefly because I know tomorrow you're also going to take a deeper dive into looking at the harbor operations. So revenues are projected to increase by just over 6%, and that's 99% of the harbor fund's revenues come from current services. And so that includes harbor leases, slip, pier and mooring fees, live aboard services, and boat launch ramp parking. And so these revenue increases are based on recent actuals, and the harbor fund has been seeing higher lease revenues than in years prior. We did eliminate revenue that was related to the RV camping program from the fund and the forecast. And then the expenditures are projected to increase by a much smaller number, 0.6%. And so when you take into account the transfers out for capital and cost allocation, that still results in a surplus of about 0.1 million. That does not account for, as you'll see in the forecast, for the harbor fund's ability to, or lack of ability to, fund what's estimated to be about 0.8 million in CIP needs annually. The fund is able to cover 290,000 of capital needs in the harbor in the proposed fiscal year. And then we plugged in that projected need for now, although there is a CIP assessment that will be proposed as well to refine that number. And that results in the fund balance going negative in the out years because that level of capital investment cannot be sustained by the current revenues. But currently, the harbor fund is meeting its reserve policy and has a positive fund balance. And then lastly, while it's not a major fund, I did just want to touch on the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA fund, because it is a one-time revenue of interest. So the proposed budget allocates basically the second half of the city's $2.5 million allocation. A lot of it is recommended for one-time uses. So all of these line items until the last one are one-time expenditures to cover the cost of public safety equipment, IT equipment, and I wanted to highlight the community grant program for nonprofits that doubles the city's investment. So we are still retaining $25,000 in the general fund for another second year of a $50,000 community grant program for local nonprofits. And then a potential contribution to regional efforts to address homelessness, as well as one-time organizational assessment and total compensation study that were mentioned. And then the remainder is recommended to be transferred to the general fund to support the government, the city's ability to provide core government services, which is an eligible use under ARPA under the final rule. And then I'll keep this super quick, like 60 seconds. A quick preview of the CIP program budget, and this will be on your agenda for tomorrow. But I do want to put into context as you're looking at the citywide proposed budget, the big picture for capital. So we are proposing to invest a total of 18.7 million in 23 projects in the next fiscal year. And as a reminder, these are new dollars in addition to any potential carry forward budget that remains unspent at the end of fiscal year 21-22. So online, you can look at the funding sources in detail. Big picture, this money comes from water and sewer funds for water and sewer projects, from the general fund and Measure Q&E for broader citywide projects, and then from a variety of smaller restricted sources like transit funds and gas tax funds. That money gets transferred into one of the city's 5 capital expenditure funds for expenditure on these projects. You can see that the sewer fund is the largest because that's where the wharf project is budgeted. And so that transfer in from the water operating fund, for example, will go there to be spent. And then the CIP multi-year plan is a 5-year plan. Has a lot of detail online. You can drill down into the different funding sources in the different fiscal years. And these numbers are not yet budgeted. They'll be reevaluated and budgeted in future years. For now, the projected needs are included in the 5-year forecast, as you saw, to provide for effective long-range fiscal planning. And this isn't going to be readable to you probably today, but this is a list of the 23 projects that Mr. Kowalik will go into in more detail about some of these tomorrow. And I just want to provide an example for anyone who's interested in going and looking at more detail online. Here's an example of the pavement management project. You can go and click on this blue hyperlink in the online budget document and view a projected timeline, funding sources, any imagery and project description, et cetera, that's available for each of the 23 projects. And that's just another image of the CIP budget online. So we encourage folks to check that out in whatever level of detail they may be interested in. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you for your patience. And as Mr. Collins mentioned, what we would be looking for today would be any input, hopefully in the form of a motion on the operating budget portion, and then the capital budget portion has actually been agendized for tomorrow. So with that, I will take this down and available for any questions, and the department head team is also available for any questions.
You got the whole crew ready to go, huh?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Hey, Sarah, again, thank you very much. And thank you, Scott. Want to reaffirm our thanks to you, Sarah, and Emily and Kelly, and the remainder of the department for all the work that you've done. Very much appreciate it. Love the new format and the background information that you have available. I know it's hard to really, go over a $19 million general fund budget or city budget, general fund budget in a very short period of time with all the enterprise funds included. But again, we're divided up into a couple of days. So I'll ask that we reserve questions or comments on the other items for tomorrow's agenda and just concentrate on what we're going to look at today. Not looking for a formal motion. What we're looking for is just at your summary comments, issues where there's agreement on potential recommendations for changes or thoughts regarding changes, but we've not done it via formal motion in the past, so we'll give our summary comments. So I'm going to start with, if you can just focus on questions at a high level, and when we're done with council questions, I do want to go to public comment because I want the public to have the opportunity to weigh in, and then I'll look for your general comments at the end of that summary comments. So maybe I'll just start, Sarah and Scott. One of my biggest areas of concern, if not the biggest, is the projections for revenues in the most vulnerable areas, particularly TOT, sales tax. I'm looking at macro indicators with regard to inflation numbers year over year at 8.4%, actual wages only rising 5 to 6%. Obviously, gas prices hiking up significantly and continuing to go up almost on a daily basis. And the CCI index scares the heck out of me. Over the last year, 25% year over year increase. Everything that I read shows projections maybe not that high, but close to that over the next year after this next fiscal year that we're considering. So I'm going to just ask the general question again, and I know CFAC maybe thought these were a little too conservative with regard to maybe TOT, but I'm also hearing that we're having difficulty in some of our businesses with regard to staffing, so that hours are being shortened with regard to certain restaurants, and because of the inability to be able to provide services. So it's a long-winded question, but I think an important one with regard to revenue assumptions. And I'm not worried about property taxes, because I think those are pretty stable and your assumption is good there. How comfortable are you, and how conservative and or aggressive do you feel your recommendations are for increases in TOT and sales tax assumptions, given what's going on in the country and in the state today?
I'll jump on that, Mayor Heading, and appreciate the question. And Sarah can jump in as well. I think it's appropriately conservative. Interesting enough, we're looking at the transit occupancy tax month over month compared to last year, which was, coming out of the pandemic. So that's something to keep in mind. But looking back prior to COVID 2019, we're still seeing TOT numbers month over month compared to 2019 are 20 and 30% above those numbers. That's with occupancy still being slightly down, but that's because hotels are charging rates that are probably more aligned with what we should have been charging all along. And further, on the sales tax side, inflation is a concern definitely on our operations, which Sarah identified. But as inflation rises, so does our sales tax revenues. But at some point, there's a breaking point where folks just, are going to have to clamp down on their discretionary spending. So I think our numbers try to account for both ends of that, if you will, of sort of like as inflation goes up, so does your sales tax revenue, because everything costs more. Thus, there's a higher revenue that correlates to that. And same with TOT. We keep seeing increases in our TOT month by month, but we're hedging against that by having these, I would say, conservative projections. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, just one thing. We did talk in detail with HDL, who again provides sales tax guidance for many, if not most, California cities, and does statewide projections, et cetera. And they have built in basically a leveling off at the end of the current fiscal year into this projection. So in hearing sort of their in-depth assumptions about that, and they look at each specific sector, they look at more of specific data. I do think it's appropriately conservative. I think we could certainly, as we always do, look at where we're at mid-year and see if any adjustments are needed. But I think we have fairly conservative projections for both of those revenue sources.
Okay, that being said, then it leads to my real question. What is your plan to be nimble and adaptive should your conservative estimates turn out to not be realistic at mid-year? What plan do you have to possibly adjust if indeed we're well behind and these inflation factors and these issues really catch up? And I'm just wondering what the response would be from the city and how we would approach that.
So if our projections are wrong if we're overconfident, in other words, even if our conservative numbers aren't met, we do have a healthy reserve to rely upon to weather, I would say, a mild to moderate recession. On the flip side of that, if we're overly conservative and we get to mid-year and we find that we are several $100,000, to the positive and trends keep pointing in that direction, then we would have the ability to discuss, where to prioritize those additional funds, whether it's increasing the investment to our pension liability fund, 115 trust fund, adding more to paving or other projects or looking at other needs in the organization, we would be able to move on those pretty quickly.
Okay, good. And we do have our emergency financial plan
Right.
To also initiate. Good. Well, thank you for that. That was one of my largest concerns. I'm trying to limit myself to 3 questions so I can give everybody a chance. So bear with me. They're probably long-winded questions, but the second has to do with the Calpers pension liability. I am gravely concerned now, and I've always been extremely concerned about Calpers. I believe the ROI on investments this year will be dismal. And I think that perhaps will continue on for another year. That may smooth out really long term. But I believe that our unfunded accrued liability is going to increase significantly in the next year, especially given the discount rate reduction. And I believe the board will reduce it again. And so have we done any modeling to specifically look at what I would call significant changes in an increase in UAL and how that potentially might be addressed, given the fact that I know we've begun with the Section 115, we're beginning to put funds aside, but that could be a huge jump in incremental costs. Just wondering your long-term thoughts about that.
I'll defer to Sarah on that one.
Okay. Sure.
I don't blame you.
Calpers has a pension outlook tool that cities can use and that we have used and have talked with NHA advisors, the consultant that we've engaged on this, to look at the current most likely scenario. And we could use that to model additional scenarios. I will say that the fiscal year 23-24 numbers, based on the discount rate reduction from 7.0 to 6.8%, will increase our normal costs, but they're projected to actually reduce our UAL, at least for fiscal year 23-24, because of the large returns that Calpers had a couple of years prior. So what we might experience is, in the short term, an increase in normal costs and a decrease in the minimum UAL required payments. And then that might flip in subsequent years if Calpers further lowers its discount rate and our UAL is reassessed. So any impact that we would have, there's about a 2-year lag. So we have a little bit of time to plan for that. And I think one of the primary ways that cities are planning for that and that we're taking action on is that 115 trust. So if we get that $1 million in there, at least that's some buffer. Hopefully we're able to generate additional surpluses in future years and increase that buffer so that we would have a larger safety net if Calpers further lowers its discount rate. But it would be a couple of years before that would happen based on their most recent high rates of return. It would take a couple of years for that to filter through and impact us.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I really should have said I'm referring to your 5-year plan and the assumptions that go out well beyond next fiscal year. But I appreciate that response and the fact that I know on a daily basis you're looking at it and following the news. I have 20 other questions, but I'll do my last question. And it's this. We are beginning to catch up with regard to our personnel, our staff, and becoming more competitive in the marketplace. Obviously, there's a cost to that, both for not only hourly wages, but also for benefits. And I know you've built that into this year's budget, but I'm wondering about your 5-year plan and looking at what I see as a continuing rising inflation period that will probably last more than 2 years, and what your assumptions were with regard. And I know you have to negotiate this, but just generically talk to me about how you're looking at the impacts of what I would consider to be rapidly rising needs to maintain personnel costs to be competitive in the marketplace and ensure that we have adequate, well-trained, excellent staff like we do now to continue serving the city. And that's my last question. Thank you.
Good question. We, in years past, very minor, meager kind of cost increases just overall in the 5-year, given where inflation is at, and all the signs point to requiring a recession to really slow that down. It could take several years, as you said. projecting higher expenses, we'll just put it that way, in the 5-year forecast compared to how we have done that in the past to account for that.
Great, thank you for that. Appreciate it. I'll look for a hand if anybody has questions. Councilmember Heller, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank all of you, Scott, Sarah, Kelly, Emily, the department heads, CFAC, for this amazing amount of information and organized in such a way that it's very comprehensible. I really like the new format, huge step forward. And I very much appreciate the work that goes into this, and I can't imagine how you can all do it, plus your regular jobs. But having said that, I kind of want to piggyback on what the mayor said. If I understand it correctly, the general fund emergency reserve minimum that we're looking for is 33%, if I'm correct about that. And then if you add the other 5 associated funds to it, we're up at 50%. Are those numbers correct in terms of what you're trying to accomplish?
That's correct. 33% is the general fund emergency reserve policy minimum, and 50% is the target. That policy only looks at the general fund emergency reserve and the general fund itself. So the 5-year forecast, which now I've lost, is the best way to look at that percentage that we're projecting to achieve just in those 2 funds.
Okay, and then if I'm correct, the way I interpret it, it looks like those reserves, assuming the assumptions that you made about TOT, property tax and so forth, revenues, it looks like that reserve is shrinking over the next 5 years. Did I read that correctly?
The percentage of operating expenses is shrinking over the 5 years. We're not projecting to draw down on the reserve. So the number of dollars that's in the savings account, so to speak, would stay the same. But as the operating budget grows, the percentage of operating that's represented by that reserve would go down if revenues don't grow as quickly as expenditures grow.
Okay. And then the other concern, really the mayor discussed it pretty well, I think, which is the unfunded accrued liabilities, which the last time I looked at it a year or 2 ago would be increasing the delta between the liabilities and basically would be increasing over the next 10 years. Is that kind of what you are projecting, or what are your thoughts about those unfunded liabilities over 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the mayor's point, it is going to depend on Calpers' rate of return in the future. So right now, their pension outlook tool shows our UAL minimum payments as actually leveling off because of the significant high returns that they achieved in recent years. If that changes, then our UAL minimum payments would increase. And so it's impacted by a combination of their policy on the rate of return and their recent historical actual rate of return. And so in some cases like this most recent year, those can have conflicting impacts on your UAL. And so you end up landing somewhere in the middle. So I think that in the very near term, like in the next, at least 2 years, we're not going to see any dramatic increases in our minimum payment, but that could change in the, 4th and 5th year potentially. For example, if Calpers' rate of return is dismal this year.
Okay, and I think the total right now in those liabilities is 27 million, if I remember correctly. You mentioned that. Mm-hmm. I've also heard a lot that only a political bailout will solve this problem. It's a huge problem in California and a number of other states. What are your thoughts about that?
It's definitely not a problem that's unique to Morro Bay. I'll say that.
It's going to take a lot of money to fix it though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you all for a really great report, a great format. Very happy with that.
Thanks, Councilmember Heller. We do have a $90 billion state surplus, if any of you want to advocate for that. Other council questions? Councilmember Ford, please.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to thank staff, Sarah, Kelly, Emily, all of you for this amazing report. As a first timer reviewing this budget, I really appreciate the in-depth, all of the different steps from introduction to, all the way through. It was really great. And I appreciate that. So thank you so much. Most of my questions have been answered at this point, but I do have a couple of, I don't know that they're high level, but I was curious. I noticed that we have one FTE for a school resource officer. Do we fully fund our school resource officer? Or I know in the past it was a shared expense with the district. Are we currently fully funding that? Do you know?
Yes, the school district made it a priority. I want to say a couple years ago. Prior to that, it was a 50-50 share. And I think we were struggling to cover our end of that, and I think they were as well. But with some of the just unfortunate tragedies that have occurred in our school system across the country, and then there was another one that happened this afternoon in Texas in an elementary school, unfortunately. So the school has doubled down on its investment, and so they cover the personnel side of the costs for the school resource officer, and then we supply the vehicle and equipment, and that individual is a member of the Morro Bay Police Department, get the training and all the other things that support their development within the department, but their personnel side is covered by the school district.
Great. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I truly appreciate having that resource officer. I just want to say that. And then my other question is under priorities, under operations, it mentions that staff is recommending that the city conduct a staffing class and compensation study. And so to compare the compensation rates with other similar communities across all position types. And so I'm just curious, would that, is that included is the cost to conduct that, is that included in this budget, or is that a significant cost? I mean, I find it valuable, but just curious about that.
Yes, there was, I think, some funding in the current fiscal year, and then to complete it, not we have started it, but just to get the ball rolling, but to complete the funding, the remainder is in the fiscal year 22-23 budget, as well as residual funds to help fund those positions that could be furthest behind once the study is complete.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then I have one last question, and I don't know if this is an appropriate time, but I know here we're talking about trying to conserve money and all that, but I have a suggestion for additional funding that I would like to request. So is this an appropriate time for that, or is this?
Could we do that during summary comments, please? That'd be great.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Further questions? Looking for hands, seeing no. Okay. No further questions. I don't see any hands up. All right, then I will go ahead and open up public comment. This is public comment for agenda item 1 on our agenda this evening, which is the only agenda item. And public comment is now open. Information regarding how to access public comment is on the screen. You can do it via your phone and or the Zoom link noted. Please use the raise hand number *9 if you're using your phone to raise your hand so that we can see that you're there. And Highland, public comment's open. Do we have public comment, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've got Mary Witkowski here for public comment.
Okay. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation. I had a question on reducing the number of funds and consolidating and how that would impact like transparency and reporting for each of them, and just how you guys are considering like right sizing the number of funds.
Okay, thank you. Highland, next public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There are no more raised hands in the queue.
All right, I'll go ahead and close public comment, bring it back. Sarah, did you want to make a brief comment with regard to your plans for consolidating funds and its relationship to transparency?
Sure. Thanks for the question. We are planning to consolidate funds that are already in like groups. So for example, in 22-23, we are consolidating, for example, the water accumulation fund and the water equipment replacement fund with the water fund. So all changes are consistent with accounting requirements, and we think it'll improve transparency because it'll improve the readability and ability to understand the budget without having to wade through as many small funds.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Now we come to council member comments, and what I'll basically ask is if you have any areas for recommended changes. I'll be making notes and then looking. I'll come back and summarize, and then be looking for a majority head nod, or if we need to take a formal vote, I'll make a decision at that time. But looking for any suggested changes to the recommended budget as presented this evening. And Councilmember Ford, I think you, and then Councilmember Addis after that.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. I have one suggestion regarding the funds that we the $25,000 in ARPA or in the COVID relief funds. Looking at that and considering the fact that we have such a great need here for young families to find not necessarily childcare, but opportunities for children for enrichment, and for parents in our workforce to have free or reduced ways of having childcare for their children, be it, going to do sporting events or any type of enrichment classes. I think it's important that we consider increasing our grant funding to $35,000 in this category, and maybe even looking at a percentage that we want to dedicate to the youth of Morro Bay. I think that it's important that I know it's kind of usually general, like, oh, 25,000 to anyone who qualifies, but I think that we really do need to look at the economic value here in supporting our workforce and our young families here in Morro Bay, and looking forward at what that could do to us here economically by supporting the children in Morro Bay. So I would like to increase that grant funding amount to 10 or an additional 10,000, and looking at identifying an amount that we really truly want to go towards children specified charities.
So from 25 to 35 in that category, and
yes.
With a specific recommendation to dedicate that to youth, young families, etc.
And I don't know if the 10,000 necessarily is to youth, but I think coming up with a specified number that we definitely want to make sure go towards,
Okay.
Children's charities in Morro Bay.
Okay.
I think is important.
I've got that. I'll come back and summarize, and then be looking for the head nods, or if we need a formal motion, I'll do it that way. Thank you. Was there anything else?
Thank you.
You bet. Councilmember Addis, I think you were next.
Oh, it's not really a suggestion. I just wanted to more say thank you to staff for the budget book that was shown at the very, very beginning of the meeting, because it's been such a long conversation and it just keeps getting better. I remember back on CFAC when we had a paper kind of trifold thing that was in the lobby, and then we had a different budget tool that was a little bit too complicated for the public, and now we just keep improving, and it's always been the focus of this council to communicate well about what's happening with the budget, and I think this is another step towards that. And so I'm just really happy to see that aspect of things. Share some of the concerns that were brought up about Calpers and the unfunded liabilities and the downturn in the economy. Those are serious concerns that I have, but the silver lining is I really appreciate the communication that we're doing with the public about this.
Thank you, Councilmember Addis. I do appreciate that. Looking for any requested changes or thoughts regarding changes to the budget? Okay, seeing no hands. We have one item of requested change before us, and that is to increase the enrichment fund, consider increasing grant funding from 25 to 35,000, with specifically potentially looking at dedication to perhaps youth and or youth programs. And I think that also fits with our goal of DEI rather nicely. So personally, I would be supportive of that. Councilmember Ford, and I see your hand, Councilmember Addis.
I should have added that part too. I was already talking, but absolutely support this. I think it's imperative that we are serving the children in this community and that we're putting attention there. And it's a way, when we serve children, we're serving families in general. So very much strongly support this.
Good, thank you. Councilmember Heller, please.
Yes, I support it as well. I think that's a really good idea.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm looking for a head nod from Councilmember Barton. Did I say
I support that move as well. And I also wanted to throw out my thank yous to the staff. This is the best looking, easiest to get through and understand. This particular budget book was just great. I've sat through many budget presentations over the years, and this was absolutely the best. So thank you for picking this out.
And I'll ask Mr. Newmeyer, do we need a formal motion?
No.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. To the point, I appreciate that. So it looks like staff, are you comfortable with the feedback? I know you have to decide where to take that huge chunk of funds from, but you have an excessive general fund emergency reserve. You could always pull a small amount of money out of that and still meet the policy guidelines of the city. So I'll just, again, I just want to I'll ditto everything everybody said about the great job that you've done in not only the comprehensive nature, the assumptions, the rationale for the assumptions. I appreciate the fact that, as Mr. Collins said, you guys have turned over 100% of your staff in the last year and a half or so. So it's an amazing task that you've had to achieve. And you guys just need to know, you folks, I shouldn't say guys, need to know how much we as a council appreciate you and all the work that you've done to get this. We've read it. It didn't go unlooked at. So, and I know this council, they review it and the information. And I just appreciate the number of community engagements or involvement opportunities that you also had as well. And we're not done because we have a session that will continue to tomorrow evening at 5:30. So what I'll do with that summary is look for a motion to continue this meeting to Wednesday, May 25th, 2022 at 5:30 p.m.
I'll move to continue the meeting to the 25th at 5:30 p.m.
Okay. Motion by Councilmember Addis. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Councilmember Barton to continue this to 5:30 p.m. tomorrow evening. Any further discussion on that? That one, we will take a roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Addis,
Yes.
Councilmember Ford,
Yes.
Councilmember Heller,
Yes.
Councilmember Barton,
Yes.
and Mayor Heading.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you so much. And thank you all again for being here. We appreciate it. Our next meeting will be in 35 minutes, 5:30 p.m. this evening. It'll be the regular city council meeting of the city of Morro Bay via Zoom. Thank you all, and I'll see you in 35.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.